Altering knitting patterns, how to get started. Hello and welcome to the Crimson Stitchery. This is a video channel about making all things beautiful and useful. My name is Anushka and you can find me elsewhere online as The Crimson Stitchery, and relevant links for this video as always can be found in the down bar here on YouTube. Now, if you've been following my channel across the last 2.5 years, you'll be aware that I've been knitting for quite a long time and I've knit quite a few garments for myself, primarily sweaters and cardigans, as well as some summer tops, such as the one that I'm wearing here today. And do check out my sweater tour videos if you'd like to have a little peek into my hand knitted wardrobe. I've knit quite a lot of different garment types, from patterns designed by independent designers on the internet, patterns released by yarn companies, from magazines, from books, vintage patterns that have been adapted and rewritten towards more contemporary styles of knitting patterns, as well as actual vintage patterns that I found scanned on the internet or just kind of crumpled up little leaflets and magazines that I found in charity shops or thrift stores or just at the back of people's bookshelves. So suffice it to say that I'm quite familiar with knitting a range of different garments, including things that are constructed slightly more traditionally, if you like, in pieces, and all sorts of top-down in the round configurations too. And through all of that, I have always altered my own knitting patterns. Pretty much always, I've done things differently than what the instructions have suggested. Many of my wonderful viewers have frequently commented on the fact that I alter so readily and so kind of instinctively, and I know that other people do this too, but it definitely felt like there was an appetite for people to find out more about how I go about altering knitting patterns. And so at your request, and also by popular demand amongst my supporters over on Patreon, I'm making this new video series tackling everything I can share about altering knitting patterns. In this introductory video, I'll be discussing why and where you might go about doing this in garment patterns, and then there'll be a follow-up video where I talk about all of the number crunching, the very simple and basic arithmetic that you'll need to be able to get a handle of in order to do those alterations. So I think that one of the reasons why altering knitting patterns can seem a little bit intimidating to some people is because when you're knitting, you're essentially starting out from nothing, from just a ball of yarn and a pair of knitting needles. And so there's a lot of imagination involved. And then when you're looking at the pattern, it's all kind of written down in words and numbers, but it's sort of kind of abstract in terms of, like, it doesn't really necessarily relate to what you're about to construct through the knitting process. And the reason that I point this out is I do feel like it is slightly different to altering sewn garments, because when you're altering sewn garments, you have the pieces in front of you already. And also, whilst you do make preemptive alterations on the pattern blocks of sewing projects, you know, you've already got that pattern block, that shape out there in front of you. And also a lot of alterations happen at various different fitting stages when you're doing dressmaking, or even just once the garment is actually finished. Whereas I feel like with knitting patterns, you know, you're kind of taking a little bit of a leap of faith. You have to use your imagination and you have to just do a lot of figuring out, guesswork, and hoping for the best, as well as drawing on experience. So in this video, I will go through the key areas in which one would alter a knitting pattern, but I wanted to open with a friendly reassurance for beginner knitters or people that are relatively new to garment knitting, or anyone that just feels unsure or possibly a bit intimidated by tackling this subject, which is the main point of garment knitting is to enjoy garment knitting, is to have fun, try something new, learn some new skills, and end up with something that you will be really proud of, because in some way or another, in one area or another, you will have learned from it. And I think that every new project has the opportunity to be a teaching moment, and that's something to always really, really remember. I know that I'm going to be going into quite a lot of depth about how and where to alter patterns, and people have already commented saying that they are just very confused and slightly put off, although they do have the desire to tackle altering knitting projects. And the main thing is just keep taking things step by step. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to start from something. So even if, you know, you've got really high ambitions and you want to go into your first 1 or 2 garments making lots of fit alterations, for example, it still might not come out exactly as you planned. And just through that process, you'll have figured out where you went wrong, what needed to be changed, what maybe didn't, you know, quite work, maybe some areas you were preemptive of, and, you know, things just panned out differently from what you expected, and so on and so forth. So the main thing is just to get garment knitting, really. Just start making your sweaters, tops, jumpers, cardigans, because that's primarily what I'm talking about. And really hone your observation skills, hone your eye, and this is something that I've talked about quite a lot through many of my tutorial videos, which are accessible through the Knitting Masterclass playlist. And obviously I'm referring primarily to the garments that you wear on your torso, but the kind of principles that I'm talking about can definitely be applied to pretty much any knitting project, as well as if you've decided to start making your own projects up from scratch, either following formulas or templates, or maybe you want to start designing your own garments, either for yourself personally, or maybe with an ambition to start publishing knitting patterns yourself. So hopefully this is all going to be lots of food for thought for you, but mainly my hope is to just encourage, motivate, and empower you to really take charge of your learning when it comes to creativity. So the thing about altering knitting patterns is that before you can do it, before you can make the alterations, you need to know exactly what it is that you want to change, where it is that you want to make that change, and then you've got to figure out how to go about it, you know, the best way of doing it, sort of in a concept, and then like kind of hard boiling right down to the actual nitty gritty and nuts and bolts of where and how you're going to be making those changes. So the first reason that I think that you're going to have to start getting involved with making alterations to patterns is if you are substituting yarn, substituting the recommended yarn in the pattern, and or you just can't get the same gauge in the pattern. But one way or another, the fabric that you yourself are producing through swatching, through making swatches, through making little tests, or, you know, maybe you actually cast the piece on already and you've just realized that something is not quite exactly the same as what the pattern sample is, you know, something's different, and maybe you've realized that by comparing measurements, or you've started to try pieces on or hold them up to you and you're like, this is not quite working out, it's probably a tension or gauge issue. Or even if you've substituted a very different yarn, you know, you might have the same numbers for the tension and gauge, but actually the drape and handle of the fabric could be totally different. And that might be because it's a different fibre, for example, or just a different spin of yarn that's got a different memory, and so on and so forth. The points of difference are so, so huge that, you know, as one person, one recent commenter pointed out, it's like, does anyone ever really get spot on gauge and manage to use exactly the same yarn in the pattern? I don't know. There's just so many variables with knitting, and that's sort of part of becoming an experienced knitter, is not necessarily that everything that you do is always exactly the same, like in a, you know, cookie cutter factory line, you know, assembly, but actually that you notice when things are different or changing, and that you have the skills and the confidence to actually go in there and make adaptations accordingly. So that, in my opinion, is the real hallmark of an advanced knitter. It's that confidence and that experience that gets built up, as opposed to just kind of being a machine. Because, you know, we have machines, we as the human species have developed machines, knitting machines, to, you know, create identical things. It's called mass production, and that's not what we're going for with hand knitting when we're making things one-on-one for ourselves. So if you, for whatever reason, have got a different gauge, or you've got a different drape and handle to your fabric, that means that maybe you want to approach the project with a different gauge, that's one reason that you'll need to obviously recalculate the pattern and make adaptations and alterations. Because at its most simple level, if you are knitting a project with a different gauge, it's going to turn out either bigger or smaller, and you need to figure out how to make changes accordingly to create the best fit and the most suitable garment for your body, or, you know, the body of the person that's wearing it. The second reason that you'll want to start learning about altering and adapting knitting patterns is if you want to alter the pattern's style lines. This is my favourite thing to do. I absolutely love it. It involves, really assessing the picture of the garment. Hopefully it's modelled on somebody. Hopefully it's modelled on a body. I mean, it's not just like hung up in a hanger, because that's never representative of what it's going to look like on an actual human. But yeah, if you want to actually make changes here or there, if you want to lengthen or shorten an area, change the shape of a sleeve, in a stylistic way, if you want to add decorative elements. These two sweaters that I have here, firstly, I've got this summer top. I changed a lot actually. I changed the style lines by adding a little insertion of eyelets around the neckline, around the sleeves and around the hem. So I really enjoyed doing that. And then in this yellow cardigan that frequent viewers will recognise from last year, I changed the style lines by changing the shape and fit of the cuff and the hem to have like a very trim little neat fit. So that's something really for you to go away and ponder and think about. When you really look at the information that you have from the pattern, from the photos, and this is why seeing kind of crowdsourced imagery of what other people have done to the same pattern, either on Ravelry or on Instagram, or just anywhere else you can, sniff out. That kind of thing is super helpful, because it can start to inspire you. You can think about your own body type and shape and the little idiosyncrasies that you have, but also just about your personal preferences, I guess, in terms of taste and style and fashion. And sometimes these adaptations can be really subtle, like this, just adding a tiny little bit of lace in, or they can be very dramatic. Altering the style lines is really a starting point to hacking a pattern and just going off and doing your own thing with it. Either you've calculated it very carefully at the beginning, or you're just improvising it on the needles. But either way, you've got an image of how you want things to be different in your mind, and you're figuring it out in the 3D form in the actual piece of knitting. So the last main reason that you'll want to start learning about how to alter patterns is related to the other two and kind of runs through everything which is about getting a good fit for your body. And as I've said on this channel before, but also explored specifically in my video called Making Clothing to Embrace the Body That You Have, I think that being confident about making alterations in order to achieve the best fit for your body is so important, and it is not reserved for people with XYZ body shapes or, one end or the other of the spectrum of human bodies. It's totally for everyone. There are just so many variations in people that it's totally impossible for knitting patterns to accommodate you. So it's up to you to figure out exactly where it is that alterations need to occur in order to fit you. And that's down to taking your own measurements, taking measurements of existing sweaters that you have, things that you do and don't like the fit of, and comparing those to the pattern. Either the pattern will have really great detailed measurements tables and schematics, or they won't, and you'll have to just go into the actual pattern instructions and figure out what the sizing is like and what's actually going on in the knitting pattern in key moments that reflect the shape of your own personal body, and figure out, what the difference is, where you need to add, subtract, or just make changes. Another reason that you might alter your knitting patterns is because you want to change the technique and the construction method that's used in the pattern for something of your own preference. Most commonly, it might be that you want to change a piece that's knitted in pieces to in the round, from bottom up to top down, changing a jumper into a cardigan, or changing a cardigan construction method, like changing the button bands or making it steeked and so on and so forth. Now, that is obviously down to your personal preference, and I'm not focusing on that side of things because I'm keeping this series quite focused to making kind of broader adaptations for the kind of overall fit and style lines. But that's something to definitely bear in mind, and all of the skills that you'll be developing, but through honing your eye, through analysing and changing knitting patterns, that's all going to be relevant if you want to actually adapt the technique and the construction method too. So on that note, I hope that that's given you some food for thought, because the main way to get started with altering knitting patterns is knowing what it is that you want to change and knowing where. And before you figured that out, it's going to be very difficult to kind of work out how exactly to go in and change the pattern. But never fear, the next couple of videos in this series will tackle how to make those changes. So all of the very simple and straightforward mathematics involved, it's really not difficult at all. But again, you've just got to know what you want, that's the main thing. And in response to a question that I recently posed on my YouTube community page, where I asked viewers, you guys, what are the main, specific questions that you have regarding altering knitting patterns? So I will be having another video in this series where I will answer those. So hopefully that will help you out in order to know how and where it is that you need to be making those alterations in the pattern. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you have done, please do hit the thumbs up button down below and subscribe to the Crimson Stitchery if you haven't done so already. Let me know if you have already had a go at altering patterns and how that's gone for you, or if you're a dab hand at it. I'm always so interested to hear back from my viewers and find out what your skill levels are and kind of where you're at. And hopefully we can keep building the Crimson Stitchery into a supportive place, because we do have a Ravelry group. We also have a Discord server, which is for Patreon supporters. And on that note, I'd like to thank all of my patrons over on Patreon, as well as everybody who has supported this channel via leaving me a tip, as I like to call it, by buying me a coffee over on ko-fi.com. Your support ensures that I can continue to develop these videos, which I'm hoping to inspire and empower and educate people around knitting, mending and making in general, making all things beautiful and useful. If you enjoy the Crimson Stitchery and you'd like to get involved further, do head over to patreon.com/the Crimson Stitchery to find out about all the exclusive benefits and choose the right tier for you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again at the Crimson Stitchery very soon. Take care, bye bye.